Hey, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. We're going to pick up again today here with Unit 11, the Cold War, and lesson number 6, the 1950s. The 1950s now, it was a booming time in the history of the United States of America, one of the more fun times in the history of the United States of America. A lot of people kind of look at it along the same lines of the 1920s, and we know the 1920s, of course, were off the chain. So when we look at the 1950s, what we're going to do, of course, is look at the unit focus question first, and we have these two unit focus questions that we will not, of course, address right now, but we will at the end of the unit. This is just to guide our lessons as we go. What effect did the Cold War have on the United States and its relationship with the other nations around the world, and describe American prosperity during the post-World War II period. We're also going to have vocabulary terms that will be introduced. And just as we always tell you, take out your journals, write down these topics, define them yourselves. And as they come up in the lesson, we will try to address as many of them as we can. But it should always start with you looking those terms up, of course, yourself. Lesson focus question. We have one lesson focus question for Unit 11, lesson number 6. And what it says is, why was America in the 1950s referred to as the affluent society? That's good. Now, affluent society. So we'll talk about that in a few seconds. But when we look at that term, affluent society, you know, affluence means good, having a lot of money. So we're going to find out why it is that we look at the 1950s, of course, as being nicknamed the affluent society. Do now activity. Just as we always tell you, take out your journals and write down the journal topic. Identify which of the following concepts, terms, and people have any contextual meaning to you. The concepts, terms, and people are rock and roll, Elvis Presley, franchises, Gunsmoke, sock hops, drive-ins, Chuck Berry, I Love Lucy, soda fountains. If you recognize any of those things, go through, of course, and at this time, take a few minutes and, you know, reminisce a few seconds. Write down what you think you know about these particular terms. Everything that you see there got its origination in the 1950s. Even with the King, he wasn't born in the 1950s, but he becomes the biggest thing going in 1950s music with hit music like Hound Dog. So you have Elvis Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi. You have franchises that would be created from things like Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, rock and roll music, Gunsmoke, one of my most favoritist, you can't say that word, it's one of my favorite television shows that I watched as a kid growing up in the 1960s, and it was already an old show when I was a kid in the 1960s. Sock hops, of course, would be dances that were had during the 1950s. Drive-ins where people, of course, went to see movies. I Love Lucy, Lucy and Ricky Ricardo, and even soda fountains, of course, where people, of course, would go and meet up and have a malted milkshake. So when you look at the 1950s, these terms all came out of the 1950s. All right, the affluent society. Now we talked about that lesson focus question, affluence, and we said affluence, of course, is when people are doing well or they're well off. And in the 1950s, the United States of America was very well off. In the 1920s, Americans were well off. The person that in the 1950s, a man by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a book called The Affluent Society. And in that particular book, what he did is describe the post-war prosperity that America had under Truman and, of course, under Eisenhower. More under Eisenhower than Truman, because Eisenhower, of course, was president for 8 years, and Truman only a couple of years, 4 years after the war was over. The 1950s, a golden decade. We call the 1920s the roaring 20s. We call the 50s a golden decade. In the 1950s, it was a decade of conformity where most Americans strived not to stand out, but to lean into the societal norms. One of the things that we noticed about the 1950s is that people, dressed the same, bought homes that looked alike. So everything was about following the crowd. It wasn't about individuality. The 1950s was about conformity. Most men wore fedora hats. It didn't matter if you were black or white or whatever, you were a business person or whatever. Most of them, when they wore a hat, like we wear baseball caps today, they wore fedoras. So when looking at it, it's a time of conformity where children wanted to be like their parents for the most part. So we're going to find there's some going to kind of push against that particular norm, but we're going to find that most children are raised to be picture images of their parents. Prosperity in the 1950s saw Americans make more money than any time up until that point in history. The advancements include the suburbs were created, offering affordable alternative to city life. One of the reasons why that was possible because of the GI Bill of Rights. It allowed people to get an education, buy homes, and start a business. Once again, going back into that influence. More Americans had children because they could afford to, because of the prosperity of the 1950s. More white-collar jobs were created because of multinational corporations and Americans bought franchises to start businesses with corporate support, like McDonald's, Burger King today, of course, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Popeyes, any number of different franchises that you can buy, where you can buy a franchise, have corporate support to ensure that you can be successful in your business by using their business model. Here is a picture of FDR signing the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights. And because of this, this is one of the things that contributes to most American affluence during the 1950s. One of the biggest things that the GI Bill of Rights did, of course, is afford Americans the opportunity to buy a home. And buying a home was an indication of, or a way for people, or Americans, of course, to build wealth. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the baby boom generation. When we look at the baby boom generation, they were the children of World War II parents. Post-World War II affluence in the GI Bill impact caused the population explosion in America. In a few minutes, we will pause and look at a video on the baby boom generation. But before we do that, we want to call your attention to a couple of things. And one of the things is this here. When we look at the U.S. population cohort project projection between the silent generation from 1928 to 1945, baby boomers from 46 to 64, of which I am a proud member of, and Generation X from 1965 to 1980, and millennials from 81 to 96. When you look at it, it is not even close in terms of which group, of course, had the most live births during their particular cohort. But one of the things that we do want to point out to you, that if you look at millennials, the Pew Research Center predicted by 2020 that there'll be more millennials alive than baby boomers. And that's pretty significant, considering that there were 14 million more baby boomers that were born during their cohort than it was, of course, in terms of looking at millennials. So what we're going to do now is have you access the video in the video description, in the lesson description, so that you can see this brief film on the baby boom generation. So at this time, go ahead and navigate to the lesson description and view the video. All right, I hope you enjoyed that film, of course, on the baby boom generation. Now, when we look at it, there's a lot of nostalgia and a lot of, there's a lot of things tied to the baby boom generation, and it becomes one of those celebrated cohorts, birth cohorts in the United States of America. Today we have, Generation X, Generation Z, but baby boomers are usually the ones, of course, that when we talk about, a live birth cohort in the United States of America, this is the group that we're most nostalgic about. 1950s technology boom. Now, diseases like polio, tuberculosis were all but eradicated because of vaccines, and cancer treatments like chemotherapy were created during the 1950s. Television emerged in the late 1940s as a new mass media, causing radio to readjust its approach. By TV took over the homes and radio took over cars. The invention of the transistor aided the development of the radio, making it smaller and more portable. Computers were also introduced to businesses during the 1950s after being primarily a military and government technology. Movies created in CinemaScope to bring big screen, big budgets, and color and glamorous actors, of course, to the big screen. So we're going to find that in looking at 1950s technology, it's going to kind of make things change a little bit in America. The radio, which had been one of those great mediums to communicate during the 1950s, will start to take a backseat, of course, to TV. And we're going to find that that's going to become more apparent in 1960 when we had the first televised presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. Here are some of those 1950s television shows. I Love Lucy on the left with Lucy right here, Lucy Ricardo and Desi Arnaz's Ricky Ricardo, Ethel Mertz and Fred Mertz. And then we have Leave It to Beaver over here, of course, with Wally, and then, of course, the character Beaver, and then, of course, Mom June, of course, and Dad Ward. And once again, you have to think about the 1950s, of course, is in terms of looking at a time of conformity. And what they wanted, of course, is kids, of course, to grow up like their fathers. Even if you look at the sweaters in terms of looking at Beaver and Wally, they have the same sweater on. Here's one of the first movies that was shot in CinemaScope. And once again, big budgets, colorized, so that, and this is one of the first films that was created using CinemaScope by 20th Century Fox, called The Robe. American music. Rock and roll emerged in the 1950s from American rhythm and blues. Young people just separate themselves from their parents, embrace the loud music, which their parents often described as the devil's music. This highlighted the widening generation gap between the parents and kids. On the left, you have the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi, and then you have Chuck Berry, of course, on the right. What we're going to do is take a few minutes, look at the science and technology advancements of the 1950s. So what we want you to do, of course, is look at this particular activity. You can access it, of course, in the lesson description. So at this time, what we want you to do is take a few minutes and work on the 1950s science and technological advances. Well, we hope you had an opportunity, of course, to go through and complete those. And we're not going to go over all these here, but we'll tell you a few things. And some of the most important things that happens, of course, is the development of the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin. And then, of course, the computer down here at the bottom, various developments by individuals, companies like IBM and Univac. And it will lead, of course, to a technological revolution in America. And once again, you can access all this, of course, in the video description. And you can go through and, of course, look at the key at your own convenience. All right, lesson focus question. I want one lesson focus question for Unit 11, lesson number 6. This is, why was America in the 1950s referred to as the affluent society? Because we had so much. The access to more money gave Americans more access to everything. American incomes more than triple what it had been between 1940 and 1955, and that income afforded Americans the opportunity to buy more consumer products, creating more manufacturing and business opportunities, access to housing, access to more leisure activities, and better health care, because the vaccine created an expansion of Social Security. So we were affluent because we had more than we had ever had before. Once again, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. And once again, as we always tell you, don't take my word for it. Do your own research and draw your own conclusions. And with that, we'll see you next time.